Southpaw fighters are a crazy bunch. Would you go into a medieval battle with no shield if it meant your opponent didn't get a shield as well? By choosing to stand with their opposite forward from their opponents, this is the choice Southpaws are making, giving up the protection of their lead hand shield to clear a path for their rear hand mace. These sinister tactics are used by the like of Crawford, Pacquiao, Lomachenko, Whitaker, Hagler, Usyk, and many others. In doing so, they can crush their enemies, see them driven before them, and hear the lamentation of their women. If you're at all into boxing, you've probably heard that the key to fighting in Southpaw, or to fighting a Southpaw, is to keep your lead foot on the outside of your opponent's. This is generally a good rule, but also a massive oversimplification. While some will always insist that their one way is the only correct way.
And Bojutsu, the ultimate evolution in the martial arts.
True masters can bend convention because they know the reason behind the rules. So let's look at the classics, as well as the stuff your coach insists not to do, but that the great pros do all the time anyways. When thinking about footwork, you should be looking to maximize your advantage and put your opponent into an awkward position. Southpaws have unique ways of doing this, and orthodox fighters fighting Southpaws can use these same tricks. As I mentioned before, a lot of your tactics depend on where you keep your foot, on the outside or the inside. But there's another equally important element, and that's the angle you're at relative to your opponent. And if that seems confusing, stay with me, because we're going to cover it step by step. For now, just understand that neither option, foot inside or outside, is inherently better or worse. It ultimately depends on what your objective is and if you have the correct alignment to pull it off. And since most viewers will be familiar with attacks from the outside angle, we'll start there. Keeping the lead foot on the outside is excellent for lining up the rear hand while keeping the attacker offline. Manny Pacquiao was an expert at this tactic, using it for his nearly patented split entry counter. The foot angle let him counter his opponent's jab, cutting through with his head safely offline and generating potent power. Since high-level fighters know how important this outside angle can be, it often leads to foot battles, where opponents try to muscle into position and tend to stomp on each other's feet while doing so, all in an effort to achieve positional dominance. In fact, this is how Marquez KO'd Pacquiao. He refused to let Pacquiao take the ideal position, and he stepped in with him, leading to a spectacular knockout. The same outside angle offers space to carve a lead hook around the shoulder.
Ceremonies a couple of weeks ago, and he just enjoys himself.
And it lines up the rear uppercut between the guard at mid to close range.
Punches 28, there is the knockdown!
And though it isn't regularly mentioned, you can also leverage this angle while circling backwards. Not only does it keep you from getting trapped against the ropes, but it presents the same targets as if you were advancing, all while your opponent steps into your punch.
See him lay on that left side.
Punching between punches and
what was to come. Terrence Crawford is the best finisher in the game, and he knew that.
From this outside angle, pivoting counterclockwise is the most common tactic. And you could do a lot from there offensively and defensively. You could exit with a jab or a hook. You could control their guard or head as you move off angle. Or you could weave or duck away. Since your lead foot is on the outside, there's nothing getting in your way from taking this position.
Let's go. Beautiful right hand.
the champ gets to him.
Truly skilled fighters can line up their jab by getting their shoulder inside of their opponents while keeping their lead foot on the outside. The reason I bring it up is because it makes pivoting out easier, while your jab is still staring down the center line. But we should count this as an advanced tactic. If you can pull it off, having your lead shoulder lined up while your lead foot is outside lets you follow up with a cross. Or provides an easy escape. Keep in mind, you can pivot out with your foot on the inside too, but you'll need to shuffle or pendulum step back and then find a clear path to exit. Purnell Sweet Pea Whitaker was extremely adept at this tactic, but it takes a lot of hard work and otherworldly skills to make it look as effortless as he did. Even if you don't want to do this on purpose, it's a good idea to practice it in case you ever get caught in this position. Now on to the third outside position. From the first position, you can shuffle even further inside, and if you can do this, your competitor will be entirely at your mercy. This position is usually achieved with something you can consider like a shuffle pivot, because you'll be turning on the lead foot to stay with your opponent. I like to call it the Matrix Shuffle after Lomachenko, and then Dominic Cruz linked my video to his footwork course students and called it that too. And he's a footwork master, so who am I to argue? It's just called that now. Regardless, the Matrix Shuffle is incredibly effective because your opponent needs to turn to face you to have any chance of returning fire. So it places you one step ahead the entire way. So while they're trying to catch up, you're already throwing your next move. A great irony about the Mayweather-McGregor fight is that McGregor consistently was able to get this angle, but had no idea what to do with it when limited to only punches. Now Lomachenko added on another trick to this, leaving his hand in front of the opponent's gloves as he moved his body out of the way, like a matador leaving the cape in front of the bull. Pointing out how he did this was one of the videos that propelled this channel to become one of the top martial arts channels on YouTube, and all the credit for that goes to Lomachenko for doing something so batshit insane. Let's look at an advanced trick from Marvelous Marvin Hagler. Now Marvelous was his legal first name, and looking at these knockouts, I think you can agree he deserved it. After taking an outside angle, his opponent would rush to escape the ropes by circling inside, away from his right hand. Instead of trying to keep his southpaw stance as he followed, Hagler would simply turn and shift into an orthodox stance, creating a shortcut to a ready position. Once there, he could cut off the unsuspecting opponents, and this didn't go well for them. Stay tuned for a follow-up video on switch hitters, and I'll go more in depth on this tactic, along with a few others. Now, let's look at the dark art positions, the ones everyone tells you to avoid, but that some of the best fighters in the entire world use regularly. Fighters like Pacquiao and Whitaker like to use the inside foot position a lot because it lines up their jab. This works the same as how the outside position lines up the cross. Keen observers will notice that the inside position has the downside of lining up the opponent's rear hand for them. But there are answers to that and ways to use it against them. Whitaker preferred to use Philly shell tactics to avoid rear hand collisions. While Pacquiao used his athleticism to evade and press further inside. Which, conveniently, takes us to the next, even more dangerous inside angle position. After Pacquiao bounded inside, he would throw the cross while pivoting to follow his opponent as they tried to circle out. This is kind of the same idea as Hagler's turn shift, because the opponent is expecting they're in a safe position. Pacquiao's method requires an unbelievable amount of athleticism, because he's turning on a dime while measuring his target. It's no wonder his left hand caught so many competitors by surprise. But more than that, there was massive power behind it.
And we thought Morales was going down. Oh, and he does go down. For a half minute to go. Plenty of time for Pacquiao if he can find the right time. Oh, and a beautiful combination. Down goes the
down. Daryl Pinkney, a good tournament fighter, knocking down, but he appears to be all right here.
You can actually take the same idea of moving deeper inside to the extreme, completely squaring up with your opponent, and forcing them to exchange wide open with you face to face.
He had him turned and they're right back to where they started.
Well, that was like the third one, but right now he's got all the campaigning and handling.
But the true power of Southpaw Footwork is only fully unleashed when you could use the inside and outside angles together, switching effortlessly between them. Check out this brilliant display from Manny Pacquiao versus Morales, where Pacquiao is able to avoid all these punches by leveraging the best of both options, weaving through as he steps to the left and right. And this can be done offensively as well. Pernell Whitaker is a 4-weight class world champion, known for his speed and incredible defense. Whitaker is insanely fun to watch fight, both because of his technical skill and his love for playing to the crowd. Far from a flashy fighter who relied on clowning and reflexes, Whitaker was a master tactician and a fierce competitor. In this fight, Whitaker was down in almost all the rounds. He couldn't win on points, so he needed a knockout. When he got his chance, his response was absolutely brutal. So now that we've established that Whitaker was definitely a fighter to take seriously, let's look at some of the more technical aspects to his game. We'll begin by looking at the foundation of both his defense and offense, his jab. Jabs can be difficult for southpaw fighters, as their opponent's opposite lead hand can easily get in the way of landing clean. As such, a lot of fighters focus more on controlling their opponent's lead hand to clear a path for their rear hand, rather than trying to jab around it. This was not so for Whitaker. Pernell was a total master of the open stance jab, making it the foundation of his entire style. In fact, Pernell heavily utilized the same circle and jab footwork as Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Robinson, and Sugar Ray Leonard. But astonishingly, he found a way to make it work as a southpaw fighter. If you haven't seen my Muhammad Ali video on this technique, I've left a link in the description. But the basics are that Ali would cross-step his back foot behind him as he jabbed, hopping and pivoting off of his lead leg as he did so. This footwork pattern is incredibly effective at turning and getting the inside angle, keeping a fighter safely sideways while opening up his opponent simultaneously. As a southpaw, Pernell used this footwork pattern to circle to the outside, which seems fairly straightforward, except for the fact that Whitaker needed to keep his foot on the inside of his opponents to cleanly land his jabs, all while circling in the opposite direction. It's already a challenge for a southpaw to not let his opponent's lead foot get in the way of what he's trying to do. But Whitaker literally put his opponent's foot in the way of where he wanted to go every time he executed this pattern. The reasoning behind this has to do with the technical aspects of fighting in an open stance, where one fighter has his left foot forward and the other has his right foot forward. In an open position, stepping the lead foot inside aligns a fighter's lead hand with their opponent's center line, making it a great angle to land jabs. In contrast, stepping the lead foot to the outside aligns the fighter's rear hand with his opponent's center line, making it perfect to land a cross. Watch as Pernell sneaks his foot to the outside to try to set up his rear hand. This meant that in order to land his jab as he circled outside, Whitaker needed to keep his lead foot inside. The only real way to do that without getting his lead foot tangled up or stepped on was with Ali's cross step. This cross step also neutralized the threat of his opponent's rear hand. By stepping inside just enough to get the job done and turning out of his jab, Whitaker closed himself off from his opponent's rear hand and was able to step safely offline. Here's something truly impressive. Pernell throws his first jab with his foot on the inside to follow the center line, and then steps outside to throw his 1-2 to get a dominant foot position. The timing and distance management involved to pull this off is absolutely insane. But Whitaker's almost obsessive attention to footwork placement played a huge role both defensively and offensively, and helped him to set up some of his biggest shots. Once his opponent got conditioned to chase him, they would overreach to try to close distance. Or turn too hard to try to angle in shots as he pivoted. Whitaker took advantage of this by breaking his own rhythm and stopping short, planting and sinking down as his opponents walked right into a hard power blow. A big reason Whitaker's opponents became frustrated enough to make these mistakes in the first place was his legendary head movement. Whitaker used the cross-step pattern for his head movement as well, ducking and slipping as he danced. And his ability to stand right in front of his opponent and make them miss every shot was always enjoyable for the crowd. But this wasn't his normal method of defense. Whitaker's main form of protection was distance management at long range, and something similar to a crouching Philly shell at mid-range. A Philly shell stance is usually a bad idea for a southpaw, as an orthodox opponent has a much clearer path to land with their rear hand. But as mentioned before, Whitaker pivoted outside with his lead foot at an inside angle, putting his center line off angle for his opponent's cross. At the same time, his lead shoulder and elbow protected his lead side from jabs and hooks. If his opponent did manage to find an angle to land his cross, Whitaker used his rear hand, often in conjunction with his crouch, to parry, catch, or even cross block. It's not as flashy, but it worked incredibly well. Something not often mentioned was how great Whitaker was at infighting. He would lean on his opponents and press on them with his head like a wrestler, circling out to take an outside angle. Another trick was to switch into an orthodox stance to angle in uppercuts. Or he could change head positions to his opponent's power side to land liver blows. Also, he loved to drive his opponent's head down with a lead hook to set up his uppercuts. Pernell Whitaker was a master tactician, a showboating crowd pleaser, and a brutal competitor. I invite everyone to check out his fights. They're both entertaining and insightful. Last year, the world of boxing lost one of the greatest fighters to ever lace up gloves. It's long overdue that more people are made aware of the incredible boxing skills of marvelous Marvin Hagler. Hagler had an unusual start to his boxing journey. He was only a teenager when a local bully beat him in a street fight and took his jacket. Instead of hiding, Hagler dealt with his embarrassment by going to the local boxing gym. He would later meet that same bully in the ring and lay him flat on the canvas. This would be a theme throughout Hagler's career. Hagler would fight anybody, and if he did lose, which was usually due to some suspect judging, he would go out of his way to avenge the loss every time. Hagler brought that same grit and determination that he had as a teenager into every match he fought as a pro, and this in turn resulted in some of the most legendary fights of all time. This included the iconic fight simply known as The War, where Hagler took on the terrifying hitman Thomas Hearns and laid him flat after just 3 rounds. And this would be no outlier. 52 of Hagler's 62 wins came by knockout. To say that Marvelous Marvin Hagler's style was unorthodox would be an understatement. Hagler used techniques, punches, and sequences in ways that shouldn't have worked. Like an expert blues singer who improvises to create an even better melody, bending the perfect note out of tune at just the right moment, Hagler was so well versed in the rules of boxing that he knew exactly when and how to break them. Put simply, the man had no weaknesses. In a single match, Hagler could outbox his opponent with technical proficiency, or knock them out with wide swinging power shots. Or, after that, he might tear his opponent apart with expert wrestling and close-range infighting. On top of that, Hagler's chin seemed to be cast from iron. And an incredible work ethic resulted in some of the best cardio ever seen in the ring. But what really makes Hagler stand out as such an exceptional fighter was his ability to seamlessly blend his stance switching with perfectly timed punches. In other words, Hagler was equally proficient in both an orthodox stance with his left foot forward and a southpaw stance with his right foot forward. And his greatest innovations came from how he shifted and combined the two stances. Last time we looked at Hagler, we took a bird's eye view and took a brief look at all aspects of his style. This time, we'll zoom in closer and look at how Hagler used his marvelous switch hitting to set up traps, leading opponents directly into fight-ending punches. As usual, Hagler's style all stemmed from his footwork. Unlike a lot of multi-stance specialists, Hagler didn't use his advanced footwork to show off or taunt opponents. His top priorities were efficiency and practicality. It just so happened that sometimes the most practical and effective strategy would be to use his multi-stance footwork to punch from atypical angles. And this in turn would help him cover greater distance and generate far greater power. One of Hagler's craziest and most unusual tools for cheating distance and entering into range was his leaping gazelle jab, usually thrown from his preferred southpaw stance. This setup was much like the leaping gazelle hook of Rocky Marciano or Floyd Patterson. Hagler would push off his front foot to launch himself forward, the shuffle putting a lot of weight into his lead hand. By shuffling or leaping into his punch, Hagler was able to cover a far greater distance and strike his opponents from a range where they thought they were safe. By keeping the punch straight, Hagler turned it into a battering ram that was far less telegraphic than a usual gazelle hook. The fact that Hagler was naturally right-handed made the punch even more dangerous. Although Hagler's gazelle jab was powerful enough to end fights all on its own, he primarily used it to hurt his opponent into the ropes. Most competitors would attempt to move inside, fleeing to the left to try to get out of the way of Hagler's right. And while this was logical, it was also exactly what Hagler was counting on. Instead of pivoting to readjust and stay in a southpaw stance, Hagler would simply turn to shift into an orthodox stance, sometimes taking a small step to cover the remaining distance. This turn shift gave Hagler just enough extra time to catch his opponent from a completely unexpected angle. Whether Hagler was fighting an orthodox or a southpaw opponent, this same tactic worked just as well to cut them off and herd them into his follow-up punch. At times, Hagler would shuffle so far past the opponent's center line that he would switch stances. From his usual southpaw stance, Hagler would move past his opponent and then attack them from his new orthodox stance. This linear shift was also a favorite of Mike Tyson's, only he tended to switch from orthodox into southpaw. This strategy worked the exact same way for Hagler, only in reverse. By putting his competitor into a stance he was completely unused to, Hagler was forcing the opponent to readjust, and he could use the extra time while they were realigning to attack them from a superior angle. But as powerful a tool as the gazelle jab was at closing distance and setting up angular traps, Hagler knew that if he relied on it alone, sooner or later, his opponents would find a workaround. Luckily for Hagler, he had more creative tactics at his disposal that helped him to set up these traps. One such method was the tried and true step-through shift. Hagler would take a step with his rear foot to switch his stance, and he could do this from southpaw to orthodox, or orthodox to southpaw. The beautiful thing about Hagler's shifts is that they not only put more power and distance into his punches while he entered, they also placed him in an ideal position to set up follow-up shots from his new stance and pressured the opponents into bad positions. If an opponent got too aggressive or tried to infight, Hagler loved to shift backwards, catching anyone unwise enough to chase him from a new angle they weren't expecting, and once again putting far more power into his punch through the greater shift in weight. But maybe the most absurd tactic, the one Hagler should not have been able to get away with, was his skipping step. Much like his leaping gazelle jab, Hagler would push step off of his lead foot, but this time, he would also catch himself on his lead foot, hopping into a rear hand attack instead of a lead hand attack. This is almost close to a Superman punch, only Hagler used the power of his front leg to launch his punch forward instead of the back leg. The only other fighter I've seen pull this off consistently has been Manny Pacquiao, but I'd love to know of any others if you want to leave that in the comments. Hagler's skipping step was also far more versatile than it seemed, as he had the option of landing in the same stance, or stepping past the hop to shift forward and continue his barrage. Believe it or not, a lot of these tactics have been simplified for clarity. So now that we're familiar with the different components, let's take a look at how Hagler strung them all together, showcasing a few masterful sequences that resulted in some terrific knockouts. In this clip, Hagler starts in the southpaw stance and fires off a gazelle hook, enticing his opponent to move to the left. He next turn shifts into orthodox and throws another hook to keep his opponent from escaping to the inside. Hagler then skip steps into a right cross, stepping through to shift forward into southpaw. Hagler has now successfully trapped his opponent against the ropes. The opponent tries to escape, this time to the outside. But Hagler's gazelle jab is not just a great tool for entering into an exchange. It's also a great way to cut off an opponent attempting to escape. In this sequence, Hagler starts by stepping through to shift from orthodox to southpaw, creating room for a hard cross. He then uses a linear shift to move past his opponent's center line and force him to change stances. Now that his opponent is both stunned and in an unfamiliar stance, his legs get tangled. Before he can finish turning, Hagler follows up with a crushing left overhand that sends him spiraling to the canvas. Something very funny, but also kinda sad, is that Hagler legally changed his name to Marvelous, and this is because much of the press refused to acknowledge his nickname, unlike his other contemporaries, Thomas the Hitman Hearns or Sugar Ray Leonard. But as time goes on, more and more fans appreciate the sheer genius and tactical brilliancy of Hagler's style. The world of combat sports should honor Marvelous Marvin Hagler, if for no other reason than for giving us some of the greatest fights of all time, but more so for setting an example for any up-and-coming fighters.